Good day, and welcome to the QEM Heroes webinar series. My name is Christine Wood, and I serve as the Assistant Program Director for the Heroes Fellows Program at QEM. And for more than 30 years, QEM has been a national catalyst for STEM education transformation and research capacity building. Currently, the QEM network serves nearly 900 colleges and universities and reaches more than 8,000 individuals nationwide. This webinar is part of the HEROES initiative. The HEROES program brings together former federal scientists to lend their expertise and support to the STEM research and education communities. Our fellows are here to provide tools and tips for navigating the funding landscape, developing STEM programs and partnerships, and improving talent retention in in-demand fields. We hope this series promotes engagement with our HEROES fellows and provides valuable resources to our participants. As a note, the webinar recordings and slides will be available in the QEM Resource Hub. By attending this webinar, you will soon be added to the QEM network and granted access to the hub. I'm so proud to introduce our Heroes Fellows today. Dr. Toni Danstedt uses her PhD in systems science and developmental psychology to advance equitable, informal STEM learning research and practice. Toni has led over 100 research and evaluation studies in collaboration with brilliant practitioners, academics, artists, and community members. Her work has explored the impacts of informal learning for people of all ages and has spanned topics including social justice, metacognition, spatial reasoning, and environmental and social science. With deep applied research methods and design expertise, Toni has experience as a primary investigator and lead researcher, an evaluation consultant, and a program officer for STEM education funding programs. Dr. Toya Frank is a mathematics educator, researcher, and STEM education leader with a passion for creating just and equitable learning opportunities. She recently served as a program director at the National Science Foundation, where she led national initiatives in racial equity in STEM education and data science core. She also served at George Mason University as an associate professor of mathematics education leadership and secondary education. Dr. Frank has shared her expertise with organizations such as the Association of Mathematics Teacher Educators, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and the Psychology of Mathematics Education North America. Beyond her scholarship, she collaborates with teachers, leaders, and mathematicians across the U.S. and abroad. Dr. Naomi Hall Byers is a social psychologist whose work examines social, cultural, and contextual factors that drive health and educational inequities among historically marginalized groups. For 16 years, she was a professor of psychological sciences at Winston-Salem State University, where she directed the Race, Culture, and Context Lab. She previously served as a program director and acting deputy division director in the Social and Economic Sciences Division of the Directorate for Social Behavior and Economic Sciences at the National Science Foundation. Dr. Hall Byers holds a PhD in applied social psychology and an MPH in maternal and child health, with expertise in social and behavioral sciences, mixed methods, and evaluation. And Dr. Tori Rolack Smith is an engineer and educator whose career includes roles as a faculty member, researcher, administrator, and program director in higher education and government. She led teaching and learning, curriculum, advising, research, recruitment, and corporate engagement initiatives in her 14 years at Howard University. Tori also worked for 8 years at the National Science Foundation, serving as lead program director for the Eddie Bernice Johnson Includes Initiative and program director for the Historically Black Colleges and Universities Undergraduate Program, HBCU UP, and the Faculty Early Career Development Program. She views her work, past, present, and future, as the convergence of professional expertise, lived experience, and enduring commitment to identifying, implementing, and studying innovation and participation in STEM education and careers. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to our presenters today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine, and good day to everyone. Let me share the slides here and we will get started. Hopefully everyone is seeing a slideshow and no alternate views. All right, thanks for confirming. So we will dive right into today's topic, which is mixed methods research, design, and analysis. And this is part one. We'll talk more about the second in this series as we go through the slides today. And of course, now my Zoom controls are covering everything I need to advance slides. So let me make that shift here. All right, I think we're all set now. Promise I know how to do this. All right, here we are. So, we want to just start off before we get into the content with just a quick disclaimer that any views that we express in today's webinar are based on our personal experiences, our professional experiences, and they don't in any way represent any particular federal agency, QEM network, or anyone other than ourselves. If you have a question about slides, we want to let you know from the onset that slides will be made available after the webinar has completed, and that will be through the QEM Resource Hub. So by virtue of participating in today's webinar, if you're not already part of the QEM network, you will be made part and will receive a communication about how to access the recording of today's webinar as well as the slides. Please also note that if you need closed captioning, that is available via the Zoom controls that you have available to you. And please feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar. We will try to address those that we can as we present the content, but we will save some time at the end for questions. And so having those queued up would be great. So feel free to submit those as you get to them. All right, as for today, we want to explore two questions as an introduction. The first of which is, what do we mean by mixed methods? And then we'll talk about why you might choose mixed methods in your research. With that, we'll go into some of the common mixed methodologies, including exploratory sequential designs, explanatory sequential designs, and then we'll talk about key considerations and challenges and end with some recommended resources and reminders about upcoming webinars. All right, so what do we mean by mixed methods? To explore this question, we want to begin with an activity. So we're going to ask you to consider this question. Which of the following scenarios is not a mixed methods study? So we're going to give you some time to read the 4 scenarios that are presented here. And we ask that you type the corresponding letter in the chat to answer the question, which of these is not a mixed method study? And this is a select all that apply. I don't want to interrupt reading, but I know that there are some who will be watching the recording and having this moment of pause. I want to let you know that your audio is not failing you. We are pausing just so that participants can read the scenarios and be able to respond. We'll look for letters A, B, C, or D, or any combination of those in the chat as you've had a chance to read the scenarios. And just in case, let me just quickly go through them for you. So letter A is a researcher gives a standardized math assessment and selects a subgroup of students for follow-up interviews based on their scores to explore why they struggled with a specific concept. So again, the question is, which of the following is not a mixed method study? That's letter A. B says a researcher analyzes scores on a reading comprehension activity across students at 3 colleges. The researcher also reviews expressed priorities in university strategic plans for enhancing student success in reading comprehension. That's letter B. C is before creating a new mental health campaign, a counselor conducts extensive interviews with students and faculty. Interview themes are used to develop a university-wide survey to measure the prevalence of specific behaviors. And then lastly, D, A survey is administered to 500 psychology majors asking for satisfaction ratings on a 1 to 5 scale, with an open-ended text box at the end asking for, quote, any additional comments, end quote. All right, I see some answers popping up, or I see some things popping up in the chat. Okay. All right, we have some ideas. We will, for the sake of time, keep going as I see additional answers coming in. And please feel free to continue to answer, I guess, right up until we give the answer. At that point, it'll be a bit anticlimactic. But let's see. I'm going to pause to make sure no one else is actively intending to answer. All right, let's keep going. So, in answer to this question, B and D. So I think we got a good mix here in the chat. Neither B nor D is a mixed methods study, and here's why. This will help us to begin to explore the question of what do we mean by mixed methods. So in B, the quantitative component, which is the reading comprehension scores, they are not in any way said to be integrated with the qualitative component, which is the review of the strategic plan priorities. And now, this is a very important point that you'll hear emphasized throughout today's webinar. Integration is key when we talk mixed methods. So keep that in mind as we move forward. As for D, and I think the majority of you mentioned letter D, there really is no actual qualitative component that is planned for this particular study. So, intention and strategy in terms of how you design the assessments and how you bring them together, that integration component really is key. Having an arbitrary kind of any additional comments at the end isn't by design a qualitative component. Now, you may be able to get some useful qualitative information based on responses, but it really wasn't part of the design. And so this hopefully gives you some idea of where we're intending to go with today's webinar. Let's answer the question directly. What do we mean by mixed methods? For today, you'll hear the reference to mixed methods as collecting and analyzing both quantitative and qualitative data in a single study. So in this webinar, we discuss how that collection and analysis takes place in different types of mixed methods designs. And we also want to note that mixed methods is a broad term that's used to refer to many things. You'll hear mixed methods to refer to a research method, as in the specific steps and tools that you're taking and using to analyze, collect and analyze data. You'll hear it referred to as a methodology in terms of that overall plan and rationale that is driving the research. It's really a philosophy in terms of the beliefs and concepts and principles that drive the study. And it's a community. It is the people who do the work and advance the science and this methodology. And so we're going to talk through that in much more detail as we move forward. All right, a few more things before I hand it over to my co-presenters who are going to dive more into the specifics of the methodologies for today. Why would you choose mixed methods? There are many answers to that question, and you'll see them listed here. Generally, mixed methods provide a more comprehensive answer to research questions and a clearer understanding of problems that might be explored in research. It's a natural way of corroborating findings and increasing trustworthiness, as well as validating results. It really is more responsive to the needs of the field because of the more comprehensive viewpoint that you take into the data and the question that's being explored. It has been found and documented as being more culturally responsive, as well as being grounded in rigorous science and having theoretical underpinnings. Those are advantages and why you might choose mixed methods. We also want to note that there are some disadvantages, and that is that being more comprehensive requires more time. So it is time and resource intensive. It does require expertise on both the quantitative and qualitative side. I could tell stories about my quantitative nature and how I haven't always incorporated the qualitative expertise that was needed but that's a lesson learned, and that is why it is very important to understand and have expertise on both the quantitative and qualitative sides when you're doing mixed methods work. Unfortunately, I'm not there anymore. I now fully understand and grasp, and today we want to convey to you what those benefits are and how to really operationalize these methods in your work. It is a more complex data integration and analysis pattern and more difficult to design just by virtue of the things that we've discussed before. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Today, we are going to look, as I mentioned previously, at some of the more common mixed methods designs. So this is a two-part webinar series, as we said at the beginning. Today, our focus is going to be on the two that you see encased here. It's exploratory sequential designs, which is an approach that considers the qualitative first to generate themes and hypotheses, and then follows with the quantitative methods to test those themes at scale. We will also today talk about explanatory sequential designs, which are going to begin with the quantitative first, like a survey, for example, to identify patterns, and then follows with the qualitative, like through interviews or focus groups, to dive deeper into the whys for observed phenomena. In the next webinar, we will discuss convergent parallel design. So if that is a method of interest, please plan to join us next month when we do part 2. Once again, you'll hear this stated many times throughout the webinar, but you don't want to collect two types of data, quantitative and qualitative, without a clear integration plan. So as we go through the following slides, begin to think about how integration is key and intention in terms of the design of mixed method studies. With that, let me hand things over to Naomi, who's going to provide more insights into the first of these, which is the exploratory sequential design.
Thanks, Tori. So, as Tori mentioned, in this webinar, we're going to cover two types of sequential design. I'm going to cover exploratory, and then I'm going to hand it over to Tony, and she's going to talk about explanatory. So for exploratory sequential designs, you would use this design when you have unknown variables, information, or you're unsure of key constructs that are important to what you want to study. Additionally, if you want to create new instruments, modify instruments, develop a new theory, or add to an existing theory. So these are some reasons why you would want to start with the qualitative phase, which is the exploratory sort of phase. So I'm going to talk about each portion of the design. So I'm going to talk about qualitative first. So as I mentioned, this is the exploration process. So you want to start with a qualitative question and approach. The key here is really the coding process, right? So you've developed, we're already making the assumption your study has already been developed. You've already decided to use exploratory sequential design. You have your question. Okay, so now how do these pieces fit together? So there are multiple methods to code, and it really will depend on your goal or your aim, right? So what I want to convey here is the importance of having a systematic coding process, which will enable researchers to extract meaningful insights from the complex data that you have, right? Because interpreting numbers is very different than interpreting words from people, because then there are things like context specific statements, there are quotes, and how do these things sort of fit into your overall design and intention. So if you have a systematic coding process, this allows for rigorous analysis of the data, which eventually enhances the reliability and the validity of the qualitative research findings. So now once we move to the quantitative portion, so once you've analyzed your data, you want to move to validate or expand upon the qualitative insights. And this may involve a multitude of things. The three that I'm going to talk about today are developing structured assessments or surveys or instrument development to gather data from a larger sample. Also, there's behavioral interventions, That can be clinical interventions as well, and then concept exploration. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. So finally, in the interpretation or the integration phase. And so here is where you're comparing and corroborating findings from both data types to really enhance the validity and produce a more complete picture, which is the definition of triangulation. And so you'll hear triangulation mentioned as you think about interpretation or integration of mixed methods. So what you produce then is a contextually authentic and statistically relevant results. No, that's fine. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about instrument development on the next slide. So the first example, really all three of my examples are really from work that I've done. I am a mixed methodologist by training. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about one particular study where we developed an instrument. So we wanted to develop and validate an instrument called identity shifting for Black women scale. So one of the areas that I research is identity shifting of Black women in academic and professional spaces. If you're not familiar with the term, identity shifting is sort of like like an umbrella term for the conscious and unconscious process of an individual altering how they talk, behave, their appearance, and sometimes perspective as a way to cope or mitigate experiences of discrimination, and in some instances to actually build relationships. You might be more familiar with code switching. And so code switching is a form of identity shifting. So I just want to give you a little bit of background on that. So to develop the instrument, we had the first portion of the project was the qualitative phase. And so for the qualitative phase, we had four major sort of steps. And I just want to note, let me stop for a second. Tony and I are giving you the Cliff Notes version of the work in all the studies or the examples that we're providing, because it is a lot more intense than we are reporting. But, we have to sort of condense this into a short webinar. But we really want to show you how these different types of designs can enhance your research. So for this particular project, we started with an operational definition for Black women's identity shifting. We reviewed qualitative literature on Black women's engagement in code shifting or identity shifting behaviors. Then we went to semi-structured interviews. So our interview guide was created based on research that we had done, published research on these particular topics. And so from that, we were able to explore the experiences, the quotations that we received from the women, the perceptions. We used thematic coding, and we took those and then combine them with, like I said, our background research, and then turn those into study items. So now, I've ran through this quickly, the qualitative. So now for the quantitative piece. So we took these survey items and created an instrument to pilot test with groups of participants who would utilize this scale. So namely Black women in academic and professional spaces. So for the quantitative portion of this, now you got to go through the whole process of reliability and validation, right? And so looking at exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis, and much like the qualitative phase, it's really a time-consuming process that requires lots of refinement and revisions. And so I just want to put a pause and say, which is why it is so important that when you're doing certain types of research, that you actually look for some validated instruments or items, because we know that those items have gone through a really rigorous process before they're able to be published and utilized for mass consumption. So now the outcome was a context-specific, validated instrument that can be used with this population in empirical studies. So much like we did, though, other researchers may use this instrument as the foundation for revisions or modifications for their particular population, or they can continue to test the reliability and the validity of our instrument in its original form. And I saw someone pop in the chat about reading about this. So if you are curious about this instrument or about the entire process, I did put a link to the published study, which was in Psychology of Women Quarterly, in our research slide. So I would love for you to check it out and provide some feedback. So the next example that I want to give, much like the previous example, where you're developing something context specific, this time we're starting with an intervention that has already gone through the validation process. However, we wanted to modify it. So this was a study that a team was working on to modify an evidence-based intervention for college students around HIV prevention, but to modify it particularly for Black students attending HBCUs. So our goal was to modify it and keeping in mind and acknowledging the importance of culture and context and what drives the need to modify certain interventions, right? So we want interventions to be relatable and relevant to the group that they're being used with. So we're starting with an evidence-based intervention already. So we had a foundation for the dimensions and the categories already. So we didn't need to create those. What we wanted to do in the qualitative phase, though, was to get feedback. So we conducted both focus groups and interviews to get the feedback, to get perspective on the dimensions and the categories that were already in this particular intervention. So we're curious, right? Are we missing anything? Is there anything that you're experiencing that they're not covering? Are there things that are relevant to your experiences that have not been covered? And so now we're going through the process of revisions and refinement, right? We are still spending a significant amount of time gathering information, even though we've started with a foundation, but we're spending time now to figure out contextually what are the important elements that need to either be included, taken out, or to revise to ensure culturally appropriate and responsive intervention is developed. So now once you have all of that data, you can start revising the intervention, right? And so now you want to move on to pilot testing, the quantitative phase of the adapted intervention. So we know pilot testing is, small scale kind of early phase trial where we're assessing either feasibility or viability, whichever term you use, but acceptability as well as readiness for a larger study. So in this process, you're refining materials and procedures, you're estimating effect sizes, you're identifying and fully addressing barriers of the intervention in this setting. So once you complete the quantitative phase, your goal is to translate these findings into actionable steps for a larger trial or implementation rollout. And just as a point of information, NIH has done quite a bit of, has a stage model for behavioral intervention development, if that's something you're interested in. So I suggest checking out NIH and all of the work that they have done to compile this stage model for behavioral intervention. And so then the last example I'll give is about concept exploration on the next slide. So this example is really about the importance of studying complex, or using this design, rather, I should say, for studying complex phenomena where both in-depth understanding and broader testing are necessary. So an example from my research would be the topic of masculinities, not masculinity with a Y, which would imply that there's only one. So masculinities are socially constructed kind of enactments of performances of men, right? And so many of the validated masculinity scales were created on specific populations and not really a variety of populations. There lacks diversity. So therefore, the reliability and multiple types of validity, like content or face validity, have been questioned. So since there's no one particular way to enact masculinities, one might be curious, as we were, about how they're enacted in certain situations and certain cultures or certain life stages, hence across the lifespan. So this is an example of the approach that my team used as we explored the topic. This is a typical approach. It's nothing new, but I want to draw your attention to phase 4. So phase 4, where the survey refinement and cognitive interviewing take place. If you're not familiar with this, cognitive interviewing is a technique used during the pre-testing of a survey instrument. It's not always used, but it is a really great tool and used quite a bit in the social sciences. So the process helps us to understand how the population of interest understands the questions and if they are culturally or environmentally appropriate for the population. For example, we presented a group of older men with a well-known validated masculinity survey that used the word dude a lot. The majority of the men in that age group commented on the fact that they did not want to be addressed as a dude, but as a man or as men. And so this played a role in how comfortable they were interacting with this particular instrument. So cognitive interviewing really brings out the importance of language, how certain context, which could be race, gender, age, geography, social class, sexual identity, how these things play a role in cognition and behavior. And so as you want to use, or if you want to use mixed methods, then you should be also very concerned about ensuring that you are being culturally appropriate and responsible to the population you're serving, because that's the benefit of being able to get the depth of qualitative and the breadth of quantitative in the same study. So my last slide, I want to end this section by just giving some lessons learned as a mixed methodologist who has been doing this for a while and have done quite a bit of these studies. So I would say first, as Tori mentioned, make sure you seek assistance for methodologists prior to beginning the project. We all have areas of expertise. If your expertise only lies in one area, qualitative or quantitative, then seek assistance in the other area. If you're interested in this design and you don't really have expertise in either area, that is definitely a reason to seek out some assistance, because what you must be is prepared to manage the complexities of conducting two distinct phases and types of research in the same project. Second, qualitative research is time consuming, but you cannot take shortcuts. It must be completed before you move on. If you try to mix the phases, you are now in the convergent kind of research design territory, and that is a very different ball game. But if you're planning to do exploratory or even explanatory, you must complete phase 1 before you move to phase 2. 3, I cannot overshoot the importance of methodological coherence and alignment, right? So this is, important. The two phases cannot be haphazardly sort of combined. They must be logically connected, conceptually aligned, and analytically integrated. It's important. I mentioned a variety of qualitative methods for gathering data. So I've talked about focus groups, semi-structured interviews. There were some observations in there. All those can be used, but there needs to be a focus on using those. Why are you using those? You must take into consideration ethical issues. Things like, are you talking about sensitive topics? What is the issue of privacy? So if you're asking sensitive questions, perhaps you consider interviews. But if you want to capitalize on the dialogue that takes place, even if the topic is sensitive, but the questions aren't personal, maybe you do a focus group and so forth. So that's why it's important to be able to have folks that you can ask questions of that can help you design it appropriately and make sure everything is aligned. And then finally, be prepared to refine, revise, and reboot multiple times. Working with humans is a complex process, which is why not everyone wants to do it. So you really have to be prepared. So I have one quick activity So we want you to take about 30 seconds really to just think about your own research interests. So if you conduct exploratory sequential mixed method work, how have you used it in the past, right? So there's A through E that you can put in the chat. If you have not used it and you're considering using this particular method, the same sort of question applies. What are some ways that you would consider using it? And so I'll just give like 30 seconds and give us, your thoughts. Okay, so we have B and D. Okay. Thank you, Liz. For B. Okay, so to generate hypotheses and test them. All right, so I am B. Okay, so, oh, yes, Angelique. Can you put it in the chat, or is it a question that you need to come off of mute for? You can put in chat. Okay, awesome. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the webinar over to Tony, so Tony can talk about explanatory sequential design and provide you with some other really great examples. And then what I will do is, Angelique, I will try to address your question. So Tony.
Thanks so much, Naomi. So I'll be talking about the explanatory sequential designs, which complete the quantitative phase before they begin the qualitative phase. And this is best used in scenarios where you're farther along in your research agenda, either in your own research agenda or the field's research agenda, like the wider question. So a lot of exploratory work has already been done. And also where you were looking to understand larger scale impacts or to understand relationships among known variables. And when we begin with this quantitative phase, we want to collect and analyze those data in order to identify patterns and relationships among variables. For example, as Tori said, this might be a survey provided to a random selection of a larger population. And as Naomi put forward, you really need to complete the quantitative aspects in an explanatory design before you start conducting the qualitative aspects, because otherwise you're in convergent parallel mixed methods design, which is also great. So it's just about knowing which research design you're playing with. The qualitative phase then involves qualitative data collection and analyses that are grounded in the quantitative findings. So 3 common ways this is done: using qualitative research to understand the outliers in a quantitative data set. When we see cases that are unexpected, interviews and observations can really help us understand those edges of the data. And this really helps explain both the fuller picture behind the findings, but also develop an understanding beyond just the averages or the typical experience. Another common approach is to use qualitative research, such as interviews and focus groups, to explain the patterns of relationships found among variables. So here, qualitative data are used to understand why or a pattern exists, or explain what's going on behind the quantitative results. And then the third way this is used is to extend the interpretation of findings beyond the sampled population. This is particularly useful if you have sensitivity or cultural or contextual responsivity that's required in order to gain valid data. Naomi, I think, described that very well. Or if a subpopulation is smaller and quantitative data are not feasible in that case. So once the qualitative data are analyzed, you're then moving on to the interpretation phase, where you are integrating the findings from both. And the quantitative findings are described alongside qualitative findings, which help explain, interpret, and extend those quantitative results. My examples will come from research I've done in partnership with exhibit developers and museum educators to understand learning and engagement in science museums. I'm also a trained mixed methodologist, so I will pull in some of that experience, and a lot of my studies have used these designs. So in these examples, I'm going to give a couple of examples of explanatory mixed methods research and how that shows up in museum research. And there are a wide variety of quantitative metrics and measures that we can use to assess exhibits and their impacts on learning and engagement outcomes. And then we can connect those metrics to different groups of visitors, such as girls, Latinx visitors, multilingual visitors, or to different design approaches, such as immersive exhibits versus tabletop handheld exhibits. So one measure that's really easy to understand is for exhibit engagement is holding power, or how much time people spend using the exhibit. And since it's so easy to describe and understand and imagine, I'll just use that as I walk through my examples. So in the first example, which is the next slide, we'll be using qualitative data to understand outlier data in outliers in a data set. And in this example, we were studying learning and engagement differences at whole body immersive exhibits compared to handheld tabletop exhibits. And because geometry concepts are the same at any scale, we were able to design a larger set of content matching exhibits that were immersive or tabletop, so we could study the difference between the two types. And here, if holding power range for tabletop experiences lasted on average, between 1 and 3 minutes, we can use interviews and systematic qualitative coding to understand what's going on for people who walk away after only a few seconds. Is it that there's confusion or disinterest approach, or does it look like it's not designed for some people and some groups of people, and why? And then for the kids that are spending 10 minutes, interviews could help us learn that for some neurodiverse youth, there is something in the design that's really holding attention. And in my experience, that understanding those outliers is a really great way to find out what your next study is, or to find future collaborators in your research. And then when we're integrating these data, we're not only describing the average time spent at each type of exhibit and the significant differences and effect sizes between the two designs, but we're also describing the experiences happening at the edges of the findings to create that fuller triangulated picture. In my second example, we are going to talk about using qualitative data to explain relationships in the data set. Based on knowledge that many science centers and their exhibits are designed in ways that are less welcoming or engaging for girls, and learning that this was holding true in our own data when exploring outliers, we conducted a really large-scale quantitative study across hundreds of exhibits, and not just at one museum, but across several science centers with nearly 1,000 youth. And then we were able to run quantitative analyses such as regressions to understand kind of which particular design features were more often present when girls were highly engaged at exhibits, including holding power, and then which were more often missing when girls were not so engaged. And that analysis narrowed our potential design features down to a small subset that can help exhibit designers better engage girls. So two useful design features in that list were exhibits with multiple sides and stations, and exhibits that included familiar objects. I'm gonna rush through Tori, so I might get us off track a little bit. So here, follow-up focus groups and systematic qualitative analyses helped us explain why design attributes might draw girls in and engage them. So for example, we learned from girls, exhibits with multiple stations keep you stimulated for longer. You can try different things and go back if you like something and try it in a different way. Or because you can be with your friends and other people, you're not just by yourself. And then for familiar object, it's like you're playing with something like a regular toy, but just at a museum. And these qualitative follow-ups provided us with girls' perspectives to help triangulate and understand the findings, and quotes from girls that helped us communicate the findings. And we also used qualitative research to extend the quantitative findings by digging into the learning experiences. So using existing literature and theory to develop deductive codes for content analysis and using thematic analysis to identify emergent learning codes inductively. And then these qualitative approaches really helped us understand and describe what learning looks and sounds like at exhibits with and without the features identified in the quantitative study. So I'm going to go to the next slide, Tori. Thank you. So a couple lessons learned. I echo everything that Naomi said, and I'll add that, they require really extensive resources, mixed methods designs. So you really want to think about how you are estimating your time and budget resources. In my experience, we can be overly optimistic about how much time each aspect will take, and that can ultimately tank both a proposal or a research study. So you really want to be clear about that. An example where I miscalculated in the study about girls' engagements, we estimated that across 1,000 youth, we would be able to describe the experiences of a small subset of trans and non-binary youth. However, none of the youth self or caregiver identified as trans or non-binary. So if we would not have been overly optimistic at the start, we could have budgeted to collaborate with local LGBTQAI+ organizations and integrate focus groups with trans and non-binary youth into the qualitative phase of the research, addressing both the smaller population size and the potentially sensitive nature of the question. And then in another example, the team's methodologists need to have a detailed sequential analysis plan before the research begins. Naomi talked about this, but also remain open to changes. I'm a trained mixed methodologist, and I still bring in other experts in mixed methodology or in quant and qual to think with me. So really just that expertise cannot be emphasized enough, I guess. And often your collaborators can help you to really interrogate and reflect on analyses in order to make changes as you're going. And I'll give this example really quickly. So we initially planned with the girls study to look at an outcome variable that compared girls and boys engagement. And that made sense because it was a study in response to discrepancies that favored boys in the outcomes, and it went through peer review and was funded with that design. But then working with collaborators, a Latinx Girls Research Advisory Team, and exhibit developers and practitioners, we were able to realize that what we were setting up an undesirable outcome, that we didn't want to argue for exhibits that engaged girls more than boys. That wasn't the point. We wanted to understand what was really engaging girls, irrespective of boys. So we needed that really detailed analysis plan and a plan for thoughtfully critiquing our approach at key moments to revise it to achieve the most useful findings for practitioners and girls. And then we're going to really quickly take just like 10 seconds to look. So if you're thinking about your own research, which ways might you use, or which ways have you used an explanatory sequential design? Understanding outliers. So just put whichever ones you've used or you are considering using in the chat. And thanks for being so engaged with us. This is very exciting. Thank you. Yeah. Understanding outliers. It's so useful. Yeah. Extending interpretation of findings. Super helpful. All right. Given the time, please continue to put your thoughts in. We are really curious to hear how you're using these, and they help us plan our future talks. So please keep going. But I'm going to pass it to Toya to close us up and summarize our what we've talked about and bring you in at the end. Thanks.
All righty. Thanks so much. Yeah. All right. So this basically takes the wonderful work of my colleagues and summarizes it into one slide. So exploratory and explanatory basically talk about like the function of the phases, where I will say I think it's important to know that these are not specific to certain methodologies or epistemologies. These really talk about the function of each phase, just thinking about the question that's in the chat. So, exploratory, sequential, we're going to talk about the term sequential and why it's really important. It's been discussed earlier. But exploratory, sequential models start with the qualitative as one explores and develops conceptual models, perhaps, and then the quantitative phase tests what you've been developing, and then they expand, and then we expand on qualitative findings and support instrument development and concept exploration, where explanatory sequential design starts with the quantitative. Maybe you're observing a pattern, and patterns raise questions that benefit from qualitative analyses. So the qualitative phase, as Tony mentioned, can sometimes explain the outliers, surprising relationships, patterns and relationships. The piece that I'll reiterate that's been expressed before is that an important piece to keep in mind is that these are sequential designs. So they're intended for the first phase to be completed fully before the beginning of the next. So often this work can not be as successful as we'd like it to be, not because it's the wrong design, but because the phases blend together when they were intended to be sequential. We're going to talk more about convergent designs, because that's what I'm describing as a convergent design. So we will discuss that more in part 2. But in an exploratory sequential, things can go awry. Like if you're still conducting interviews while trying to develop a survey without having all of your interview data collected and analyzed. So we really want to make sure in sequential analyses that we follow the order intended. Otherwise, you'll be transitioning into a convergent design, which is also a valid way to do things, but has a different set of parameters. So we invite you to join us for part 2 on August 27th, where we'll do a deeper dive into convergent designs. And so some key challenges to consider as you move into sequential mixed methods. So as mentioned earlier, there are mixed methods increase the decisions that have to be made along the way. So they present some unique sets of complexities for us. So, like every choice has to be justified within each phase. And then you have to think about that integration phase or the green phase, because we tried to color code things to keep them nice and orderly. So, that integration phase or the green phase, if you go back and review our slides, I saw someone requesting the slides, is really important because there's another set of considerations there, which increases the complexity of the work. As Naomi said, this is a snapshot. This nowhere near captures the complexity of doing this work. And in terms of resources, to the second point there around extensive resources regarding time, personnel, participation, and funds. Um, when Let's talk a little bit about if you were taking a mixed method design and presenting it in a proposal. Funders and reviewers often look at your budget. Your budget should be able to tell a story of you intending to do mixed methods work. So, under budgeting is a common pitfall that sometimes happens in proposals. Proposals sometimes put forth ambitious mixed methods designs, but their budgets are too thin. So you have to be really clear about where the money goes. So thinking about things like transcription and qualitative and quantitative analysis tools and software, thinking about sufficient personnel to do both qualitative and quantitative kinds of coding, and making sure that you have enough participants for the quantitative strand so that you have statistical power if it is necessary. You also want to make sure that you understand that it can be slow and that it can be iterative, and it's really hard to compress because these are sequential designs. So you really have to make sure that one phase is done to completeness before beginning the next. And then at the end, integration is its own kind of labor. And it's not just something that happens at the end, because you really don't want to look like you're just stitching two projects together. You want to fully merge the two designs to tell a comprehensive story in your work. And I also do mixed methods, but I come to mixed methods through a lot of quantitative work. But the questions that I pose needed more comprehensive study. So I also use mixed methods a lot. And very few of us, including myself, are equally strong in both traditions. At this point, I might say I'm stronger in qualitative than quantitative, just given the nature of the questions that I ask in my field. But the team has to cover both approaches well. Um, and so there's risk when either you don't have formal mixed methods training or in a particular phase, because or if you have expertise in one, you have to be careful not to default and really focus on the area where you feel strongest. So as we mentioned earlier, this is where bringing in methodologists to support the research is important. So I would also just say, in relation to funding, that it'd be really important to bring in a methodologist early. You don't have to wait until you win funding or an award is made. You can bring methodologists in as early as like designing your study and writing your proposal, because weighing in early can strengthen the proposal. Because funders and reviewers, when they read proposals, are looking for evidence that the expertise on your team matches the design of your study. Next slide, please. And so quickly, I'll just note that there are some resources here. I think that Plano, no, it's the Cresswell and Cresswell, I believe. When someone asked the question about the ethnographic approach, which I think has more sort of paradigms and methodologies attached to it, where if you look at like I think it's a Cresswell and Plano piece, it really talks about this idea of explanatory versus exploratory and how those describe like the function that is happening at each phase, and it's sort of methodological or epistemological, sort of agnostic, right? Just really talking about the phases and the function of each phase. So I think that would be a nice piece to visit. And my wonderful colleagues who've described their work, there are some links to their work there. In the first column, exhibit designs for girls' engagement. In the second column, the piece on identity shifting. I believe there's one in the third column as well about the tabletop exhibit. So we welcome you to take a visit and visit these links. They're linked, so when you get the copy of the slides, you'll be able to go directly to the websites and to the resources. Next slide, please. So so we will close with inviting you to visit our series. So this is part of a larger series of presentations that we have been giving since the beginning of our tenure as Heroes. And so we wanted to provide information both on those. We had one in June, but they go back as far as February, and to invite you and provide some information on the upcoming webinars in our series, Capacity Building for Applied STEM Education and Behavioral Sciences Research. So if you have questions, or if you would like to just talk mixed methods with us, we invite you to contact us. Our information is there. Please feel free to click the QR codes to access the information that is here. And on the Heroes webpage, you'll be able to see information about all the fellows, not just those of us in the presentation today. And you can learn about all of the Heroes' expertise in the geographical areas that they cover. We also have a feedback form that we'd love for you to complete. So let us know your thoughts on this webinar or any topics that you'd like to see covered in the future, and as well as any other general or specific feedback that you have for us.
Thank you so much to our presenters today for a wonderful and informative presentation. We do have one raised hand, and with 1 minute left, I am going to allow Joan Marshall Wesley to come off mute to ask a question. Joan, are you there? Yeah. Okay, well, with that, we will. Okay.
Can I respond to someone in the chat then very quickly?
Yes, of course.
to Zing. If you have attended webinars but not received an email about to access the QEM resources, just email one of us, any one of us, and we'll figure it out with you. It takes a little bit, but it takes about a week. But if you've attended several, that probably means it hasn't been a week yet. So feel free to reach out to me and I'll figure it out for you.
Actually, he doesn't have to reach out. I will go ahead and take care of it. I've got his name.
Thank you, Tarina.
All right, well, with that, I want to thank everyone for attending today, and thank you to our presenters for summarizing these links on the closing page. Feel free to reach out to any of our fellows at any time for any kind of help or questions about your research projects, your funding, grant proposal development, all of those good things. And we thank you so much for coming today. We hope to see you at a future webinar. Thank you so much.